The rain had started 3 hours before the ceremony, and now it drummed against the chapel's stained glass windows like impatient fingers. I stood at the back of the crowded hall, my pale blonde hair twisted into a braid that felt too tight, my dress, borrowed from my cousin, scratching against my collarbones. Around me, girls in silk and lace whispered and giggled, their perfumes mixing into a suffocating cloud of jasmine and rose. Tonight was the claiming moon, the night when unmated Lycans would choose their partners, and I was here only because refusing to attend would have marked me as defiant. I didn't want to be claimed. I didn't want to be seen. The wooden pews creaked as families shifted, craning their necks to watch the procession of eligible women walking down the aisle. My hands trembled as I gripped the simple cotton of my skirt. I'd been invisible my whole life. The orphan raised by a distant aunt who saw me as obligation rather than family. The girl who cleaned the pack house floors while others trained in combat. My wolf had never surfaced, not even during my first shift ceremony 5 years ago. The healers said she was dormant, others said she was broken, just like me. "Stand straight," my aunt hissed from beside me, her fingers digging into my arm. "You're representing our bloodline, thin as it is." I straightened, though my heart hammered against my ribs. The bloodline she spoke of was nearly forgotten. My mother had died when I was 3. My father shortly after in a border skirmish. All I had of them was a single memory, my mother's voice singing a lullaby about silver moons and brave hearts. "Even the smallest flame can light the darkest cave," she'd sung. I'd carried those words like a talisman through every lonely year. The chapel doors burst open with a gust of wind that extinguished half the candles. The crowd fell silent. He entered like a storm given form. King Dominic Ashenfell. Even his name felt dangerous on my tongue when I dared to think it. He was taller than anyone I'd ever seen, his shoulders broad beneath a black coat that seemed to absorb the remaining light. His hair was dark as midnight, falling just past his collar, and his eyes, even from this distance, I could feel the weight of them, were the color of amber trapped in ice. Cold, ancient, alone. The king hadn't attended a claiming moon in 7 years, not since his mate died in the vampire wars. The rumors said he'd torn through enemy lines like a demon, that he'd returned covered in ash and blood, that he'd locked himself in the northern tower for 3 months and emerged different, harder, unreachable. Yet here he was. Women preened and postured as he walked past, their wolves rising to the surface, eyes flashing gold and silver. Power recognized power, and every she-wolf in this room wanted to be the one to thaw the frozen king. I shrank further into the shadows, making myself small. Invisible was safe. Invisible meant I could return to my attic room, and my books, and my solitude. His footsteps stopped. The air changed, crackling with an electricity that raised every hair on my arms. I kept my eyes down, studying the worn floorboards, but I could feel something shift in the atmosphere. A presence, enormous and overwhelming. "Look at me." The voice was deep, rough, like gravel and silk woven together. A command that bypassed my brain and went straight to my spine. My head lifted before I could stop it. King Dominic stood 3 feet away, and the world narrowed to just his face. Up close, I could see the silver scars that traced his jawline, the weariness that lived in the set of his mouth, the way his eyes, God, his eyes, seemed to look not at me but through me, peeling back every defense I'd ever built. "What's your name?" he asked. My throat had gone dry. Around us, I could hear the whispers starting, feel the weight of hundreds of stares. My aunt's fingernails bit deeper into my arm, whether in warning or encouragement, I couldn't tell. "Elena," I managed. Elena Thornfield. Something flickered across his face, too quick to read. His gaze traveled over me, not with the hungry assessment I'd seen other men use, but with a strange kind of recognition, as if he were searching for something he'd lost, and found it in the last place he expected. "Thornfield," he repeated softly. "The Northern Line." I nodded, confused. My family had once held lands in the Northern Territories, before the wars, before the shame of my father's death had reduced us to charity cases. How did he know? The king took a step closer, and my wolf, my dormant, broken wolf, stirred. It was barely a whisper, like something waking from a long sleep. But it was there. After 5 years of silence, of emptiness, something inside me moved. His nostrils flared. "You don't know, do you?" he murmured. And I wasn't sure if he was talking to me or to himself. "Your Majesty," my aunt interjected, her voice honeyed and false. "My niece is honored by your attention, but surely there are more suitable candidates. Leave us." 2 words. Absolute. My aunt's hand dropped from my arm as if burned, and she retreated with a tight smile and poisonous eyes that promised punishment later. The other families stepped back, creating a circle around us, and I stood there trembling, a rabbit before a wolf. But King Dominic didn't look like a predator. Not exactly. There was hunger in his gaze, yes, but also something that looked almost like pain. Loneliness. The same ache that lived in my own chest during the long nights when I wondered if I'd ever belong anywhere. "How old are you, Elena?" he asked quietly. 23, Your Majesty." "And your wolf?" The shame rose hot in my cheeks. "Dormant. She's never... I can't shift." I waited for the dismissal, the same disappointment I'd seen on every face when this truth came out. Instead, his expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Not dormant," he said, waiting. Before I could ask what he meant, he extended his hand. It was scarred, the knuckles rough, the kind of hand that had seen battle and survival. "Walk with me." It wasn't a request, but there was something in his tone, a gentleness that seemed to cost him effort, that made it feel less like a command and more like an invitation. I glanced around at the sea of shocked faces, at my aunt's tight-lipped fury, at the other women whose eyes burned with envy and malice. I placed my hand in his. His fingers closed around mine, warm and solid, and that whisper inside me, my wolf, stirred again, stronger this time. He led me through the parting crowd, out of the chapel, into the rain-soaked night. Thunder rolled across the mountains, and the wet earth smelled of pine and possibility. We walked in silence through the gardens behind the chapel, the rain soaking through my thin dress, plastering my blonde hair to my neck and shoulders. I should have been cold, but his presence radiated heat like a furnace. He still held my hand. "Do you know why I came tonight?" he asked finally, stopping beneath an ancient oak whose branches formed a canopy against the storm. I shook my head, water droplets falling from my lashes. "Because 7 years ago, I made a promise to someone dying," he said, his voice barely audible above the rain. "She told me that darkness would try to claim me, that I would forget what it meant to feel anything but rage. She made me swear that when I was ready, when I could be something other than a weapon, I would come to a claiming moon, and I would choose with my heart, not my crown." His thumb traced across my knuckles, and electricity shot up my arm. "I wasn't going to keep that promise," he continued. "I came here tonight to prove that there was nothing left in me to save, that I was exactly the monster everyone whispers about." His eyes found mine in the darkness, and they were burning now, bright and fierce. "And then I caught your scent." My breath hitched. "My scent? Like winter roses and old books and something." He leaned closer, and I could feel the heat of him, the barely controlled power that made the air vibrate. Something that calls to the broken parts of me and says they're not beyond repair. I didn't understand. I was nobody. Nothing. A wolfless outcast in a borrowed dress. But the way he looked at me made me feel like I was someone worth finding. "I don't know what you think you sense," I whispered, "but I'm not special. I'm not—" "You're terrified right now," he interrupted gently. "Your heart is racing. You want to run. Every instinct is telling you that I'm dangerous, that this is too much, too fast." His other hand came up, and I thought he might touch my face, but he stopped just short, his fingers hovering near my rain-wet cheek. "But you're still standing here. Do you know why?" I shook my head again, mesmerized. "Because you're braver than you know," he said softly, "and because something in you recognizes something in me." The rain fell harder, and somewhere in the distance I heard the chapel bells beginning to ring, the signal that the claiming ceremony was beginning. We should go back. This was madness. Kings didn't choose broken, wolfless orphans. This had to be some kind of mistake, or worse, a cruel joke that would end with my humiliation. But then King Dominic did something that shattered every defense I had left. He smiled. It was small, barely a curve of his lips, but it transformed his entire face. The coldness melted, and for just a moment, I saw the man beneath the crown, someone who'd been alone for so long, he'd forgotten what warmth felt like. "I should warn you," he said, and there was something almost playful in his tone now. "I'm not good at this. It's been a very long time since I've tried to be anything resembling gentle." "Good at what?" I breathed. His hand finally made contact, fingers brushing my cheek with a tenderness that made my knees weak. "Courting," he murmured. "Connection. All the things that come before." He trailed off, his gaze dropping to my lips, and suddenly I understood. Heat flooded my face, my neck, my entire body. I'd never been courted, never been kissed, never been touched with anything approaching desire. "I've never," I started, then stopped, mortified. "Never what?" His voice had dropped lower, intimate in the darkness. I forced myself to meet his eyes. If this was real, if any of this was actually happening, I wouldn't face it as a coward. "I've never been kissed," I said. The words hung between us, vulnerable and raw. I waited for his expression to change, for disappointment or pity or amusement. Instead, King Dominic leaned closer, until his forehead nearly touched mine, until I could feel his breath against my rain-wet skin. "Then let's start slow," he whispered. And the world held its breath. He didn't kiss me that night beneath the oak tree, though every nerve in my body had been screaming for it. Instead, King Dominic had tucked a strand of wet hair behind my ear, his fingers lingering against my temple for just a heartbeat longer than necessary, and said, "Come to the castle tomorrow, at sunset." Then he'd walked me back to the chapel, announced to the stunned assembly that the claiming moon would reconvene in 1 week's time, and disappeared into the rain-soaked darkness, leaving me standing in a puddle of water and confusion, while my aunt's face turned the color of spoiled milk. The ride back to our small cottage on the edge of Packlands had been silent, except for the drumming rain and my aunt's labored breathing, the kind that came before an explosion. I'd prepared myself for her fury, for accusations of seduction or scheming, but she'd simply stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before, fear mixed with calculation. "You will go tomorrow," she'd said finally, as we stood dripping in the narrow hallway. "You will be respectful and obedient, and if the king shows you any favor, Elena, you will not squander it with your usual awkwardness." I'd nodded, too overwhelmed to argue, and retreated to my attic room where I'd stripped off the borrowed dress and stood shivering in the darkness, replaying every moment, his hand in mine, his voice saying my name like it meant something, the way his eyes had softened when I'd confessed I'd never been kissed. Let's start slow. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt phantom warmth where his fingers had touched my face, heard the roughness of his voice cutting through the rain. My wolf, that mysterious presence that had been silent for so long, kept stirring restlessly, like something pacing behind a locked door. By the time sunset approached the following evening, I'd changed clothes 4 times. Everything I owned was either too worn, too plain, or too obviously inadequate for visiting a castle. I finally settled on a simple blue dress that my mother had made years ago, the only nice thing I possessed that actually fit. I braided my blonde hair away from my face, scrubbed my hands until they were raw, and stared at my reflection in the cracked mirror. I looked terrified. The walk to Castle Ashenfeld took 40 minutes through the forest path, and with each step, my courage wavered. This was insane. Kings didn't court orphans. There had to be some explanation, some political maneuvering I didn't understand. Maybe he needed to appear merciful before his council. Maybe this was about my forgotten bloodline, some debt or alliance from the old wars. Maybe he pitied me. That thought nearly made me turn back. But then I remembered the loneliness in his eyes, the way he'd looked at me like I was an answer to a question he'd been asking for years. Whatever this was, it didn't feel like pity. The castle loomed ahead, all gray stone and towering spires that pierced the twilight sky. Guards stood at the gate, their expressions carefully neutral as they examined me. One of them, a young man with kind eyes, cleared his throat. "Miss Thornfield? His Majesty is expecting you. I'll escort you to the Western Garden." Western Garden. Not a throne room or formal hall. Something in my chest loosened slightly. The castle's interior was overwhelming. Vaulted ceilings painted with scenes of ancient battles, tapestries depicting the Lycan bloodlines, floors so polished I could see my reflection. Servants moved through the corridors like ghosts, their eyes sliding over me with curiosity and confusion. I heard whispers trailing in my wake. "That's her? The wolfless one? What could the king possibly want with... Poor thing doesn't even know how to walk properly." I kept my chin up, my mother's lullaby playing in my head. Even the smallest flame can light the darkest cave. I had as much right to be here as anyone. King Dominic himself had invited me. The Western Garden was nothing like the manicured grounds near the chapel. This was wild, untamed, roses growing in chaotic tangles, ivy crawling up stone walls, a small fountain covered in moss. Twilight painted everything in shades of purple and gold, and the air smelled of honeysuckle and approaching night. He stood with his back to me, staring at the fountain. He'd traded his formal coat for something simpler, dark trousers and a white shirt, with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing forearms marked with more of those silver scars. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, as if he'd been running his hands through it. "You came," he said without turning around. "You asked me to." My voice came out steadier than I felt. He turned then, and something in his expression made my breath catch. He looked almost nervous. The mighty Lycan king, the warrior who'd faced down vampire armies, looked uncertain. "I wasn't sure you would," he admitted. "Last night, in the rain, it all seemed..." He paused, searching for words. "Possible. But in daylight, with time to think, I thought you might realize how strange this is." I took a few steps closer, my heart hammering. "It is strange," I agreed. "I still don't understand why you..." "Sit with me," he interrupted, gesturing to a stone bench near the fountain. "Please, this will be easier if I can explain properly." We sat, leaving careful space between us, though I was acutely aware of his proximity. This close, I could see the fine lines around his eyes, the tension in his jaw, the way his hands rested on his knees as if he had to consciously stop them from reaching for me. "7 years ago," he began quietly, "I lost everything that mattered. My mate, Isabel, was a healer. Gentle, kind, everything I wasn't. When the vampires attacked our eastern border, she went to tend the wounded." His voice roughened. "She was killed in a secondary assault. They targeted the medical camps deliberately." "I'm sorry," I whispered, meaning it. He nodded, accepting the condolence. I became someone I didn't recognize after that. Anger was easier than grief, so I fed the rage until there was nothing else left. My council was terrified of me. My own guards walked on eggshells. I was a good king for war. But peace? He laughed bitterly. I had no use for it. The fountain burbled softly between us. A night bird called from somewhere in the roses. 3 months ago, something changed, he continued. I was hunting alone in the Northern Territories. Your family's old lands, actually, and I found something. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn leather journal. This was hidden in the ruins of an old watchtower. It belonged to your mother. My heart stopped. What? Evelyn Thornfield. She was a historian. Did you know that? He opened the journal carefully, showing me pages filled with elegant handwriting. She documented the old bloodlines, the ancient gifts that ran through Lycan families before the wars diluted everything. I stared at my mother's handwriting, tears pricking my eyes. I'd had nothing of hers except vague memories. According to her research, King Dominic said softly, the Thornfield line carried a rare gift. The ability to sense and soothe the darkness in others. They were called Lightbringers, though the name was forgotten over time. Your mother theorized that the gift manifested differently in each generation, sometimes appearing as healing, sometimes as emotional empathy, sometimes... He looked at me intently. sometimes as a wolf that only emerges when it finds its true purpose. My hands trembled as I touched the journal's pages. You think that's why my wolf hasn't surfaced? Because she's waiting for what? For what she's meant to protect, he said. For who she's meant to anchor. The implication hung in the air between us, heavy and impossible. That's insane, I breathed. You're saying my wolf has been dormant because she was waiting for you? I'm saying that when I caught your scent last night, for the first time in 7 years, the rage quieted, he said, his voice raw with honesty. I'm saying that standing near you makes me feel like I can breathe properly again. I'm saying that I've spent months reading your mother's journal, trying to understand why I felt drawn to those northern ruins, and then I walk into a claiming moon I had no intention of honoring, and I see you. He stopped, closing his eyes. And everything made sense. I couldn't speak. This was too much, too fast, too utterly overwhelming. He was describing a fairy tale, a destiny written in old journals and ancient bloodlines, and I was just Elena, invisible. Broken Elena who'd spent her whole life being nobody. I know this is a lot, he said, gentler now. I know I'm asking you to believe in something that sounds like madness. But Elena? He shifted on the bench, turning to face me fully. I'm not asking you to accept a mating bond tonight. I'm not asking you to love me or even trust me yet. I'm just asking if you'll let me try. Try what? I whispered. To be worthy of what your mother's bloodline represents. To be someone capable of gentleness again. His hand lifted slowly, giving me time to pull away, and cupped my cheek with a tenderness that made my throat tight. To court you properly, slowly, the way you deserve. A tear slipped down my face, and his thumb caught it. I've never been enough for anyone, I said, the truth spilling out. My aunt sees me as a burden. The pack sees me as defective. I've spent my whole life trying to be invisible because being seen only meant being reminded of everything I lack. You're not invisible to me, King Dominic said fiercely. You're the only thing I've been able to see clearly in years. Something cracked open in my chest. Some ancient, wounded place that had never known kindness. My wolf stirred again, stronger now, and I could almost feel her pressing against my consciousness, urging me toward this man who looked at me like I hung the moon. I don't know how to do this, I admitted. I don't know how to be courted or how to act around a king or just be yourself, he interrupted. Be the woman who stood in the rain last night and didn't run. Be the woman brave enough to come here despite every logical reason not to. His other hand found mine, our fingers intertwining. That's all I'm asking. We sat there as the twilight deepened into true darkness, hands joined, his thumb tracing absent patterns on my skin. It should have felt awkward or forced. But instead, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Tell me about your mother, he said eventually. Your memories of her. So I did. I told him about the lullabies, the smell of lavender that always clung to her dresses, the way she'd read to me every night from books about brave heroines and magical wolves. I told him about the emptiness her death had left, the way my aunt had never let me speak of her, as if my parents were shameful secrets to be buried. He listened with absolute attention, his eyes never leaving my face, and when I finished, he said, "She would be proud of you, the woman you've become despite everything." How could you possibly know that? Because her journal's last entry was about you, he said softly. She wrote it the week before she died. She said she worried about leaving you too soon, but that she could already see the strength in you. My Elena has a light that no darkness will ever fully extinguish, she wrote. She will illuminate paths for others, even when she cannot see her own way. I was crying openly now, and King Dominic pulled me closer, letting me rest my head against his shoulder. He smelled like pine and smoke and something wild, and my wolf practically purred at the contact. "Stay for dinner," he murmured into my hair. "Let me feed you. Let me show you that not everyone in this world sees you as a burden." I nodded against his shoulder, too overwhelmed for words. That night, I dined with a king in a private room overlooking the gardens, and he asked me about books and dreams and what I'd do if I could go anywhere in the world. He didn't ask about my missing wolf or my tragic bloodline. He asked about me. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I might actually be worth knowing. The days that followed fell into a rhythm I'd never imagined possible. Every evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, I would walk the forest path to Castle Ashenfell, and King Dominic would be waiting. Sometimes in the garden, sometimes in the library, a vast room with floor-to-ceiling shelves that smelled of aged paper and possibilities, and once, memorably, in the castle's kitchens where he'd attempted to bake bread and created something that resembled a weapon more than food. "I'm a king," he'd said, laughing at my expression as I'd poked the rock-hard loaf. "I'm not supposed to be good at domestic tasks." That laugh had been a revelation. Each day, I watched the ice around him thaw a little more, watched him remember how to smile without it looking like it pained him. And each day, my wolf grew stronger, her presence a constant hum beneath my skin, patient and purposeful. But the castle wasn't just King Dominic and secret gardens. There were others. His inner circle, the people who kept the kingdom running, and who watched my growing presence with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. Sebastian, the king's beta and closest friend, was the first to truly speak to me. I'd been leaving the library one evening, my arms full of books King Dominic had insisted I borrow, when I'd nearly collided with a tall man with copper hair and sharp green eyes. "Careful," he'd said, steadying the toppling stack. His gaze had been assessing, not unkind but intensely thorough. "So, you're the one who's brought him back from the dead," I'd blinked. "I'm sorry?" "Dominic," he'd clarified, a small smile playing at his lips. "7 years I've watched him turn into stone. 3 weeks with you, and he's actually participating in council meetings instead of glowering until everyone agrees with him out of self-preservation." Sebastian had studied me for a long moment. "I don't know what you're doing, Elena Thornfield, but don't stop." That conversation had been the first of many. Sebastian became an unexpected ally, often appearing to escort me through the castle's more intimidating corridors, deflecting questions from curious courtiers with practiced ease. He told me stories about King Dominic before the wars, a younger man who'd loved astronomy and terrible jokes, who'd once climbed the castle's highest tower on a dare and gotten stuck for 3 hours. He was always serious, Sebastian had said one afternoon as we'd walked through the eastern wing. But he used to have lightness in him, too. "You're bringing that back." Not everyone was pleased by this development. Lady Celeste Ravenscar was beautiful in the way of predators, all sharp angles and calculated grace, with midnight black hair and eyes like chips of ice. She'd been at the Claiming Moon, one of the women in silk who'd postured and preened, and from the moment I'd first seen her watching King Dominic and me in the garden, I'd known she was dangerous. She cornered me one afternoon in the portrait gallery, her smile all teeth and venom. "How quaint," she'd purred, circling me slowly. "The charity case thinks she can play at being queen." I'd kept my voice steady, even as my heart raced. "I'm not playing at anything, Lady Ravenscar." "Aren't you?" She'd stepped closer, and I'd caught the scent of her perfume, overwhelming, cloying. "You do realize this is temporary, don't you? Dominic is indulging a whim, perhaps trying to prove to himself that he's still capable of softness, but men like him don't end up with girls like you." Her gaze had raked over my simple dress, my unadorned hair. "They come to their senses and choose women who can actually stand beside them as equals. Is that what you think you are?" I'd asked quietly. "His equal?" Her eyes had flashed. "I am highborn, trained in combat and diplomacy, capable of shifting into a wolf that could tear you apart without breaking stride." She'd leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "What are you, Elena? A broken little thing with a dormant wolf and a tragic bloodline. You bring nothing to this court except a pretty face and a sad story." The words had struck like physical blows, hitting every insecurity I'd ever harbored. But before I could respond, a low growl had echoed through the gallery. King Dominic had materialized from a side corridor, and the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. His eyes were blazing, his power rolling off him in waves that made the paintings rattle on their hooks. "Lady Ravenscar," he'd said, his voice terrifyingly soft, "you will apologize to Elena, and then you will remove yourself from this castle for the remainder of the season." Celeste had gone pale. "Your Majesty, I was merely—" "Apologize. Now." She'd stammered an apology, her composure shattered, and fled with her tail metaphorically between her legs. King Dominic had immediately turned to me, the fury melting into concern. "Are you all right? Did she hurt you?" "Just words," I'd said, though my hands were shaking. He'd pulled me into his arms then, right there in the portrait gallery where anyone could see, and held me until the trembling stopped. "Her words are poison born of jealousy," he'd murmured against my hair. "Don't let them take root." But some damage had been done. That night, alone in my attic room, Celeste's accusations had echoed. "What are you?" I'd stared at my reflection, seeing what everyone else saw, a wolfless girl playing dress-up in a world where strength was everything. The next evening, I'd almost stayed home, almost convinced myself that King Dominic deserved better, that I was being selfish by letting this continue. But then I'd remembered the way he looked at me, the way his darkness quieted when I was near, and I'd forced myself back onto the forest path. He'd known something was wrong the moment he saw me. "What happened?" he'd asked, cupping my face in both hands. We were in the library, surrounded by books and fading sunlight, and his eyes searched mine with an intensity that made me want to confess everything. "Do you ever doubt this?" I'd whispered. "Us? Whatever this is becoming. Every day," he'd admitted, and the honesty had startled me. "I doubt that I'm good enough for you, that I can be gentle enough, patient enough, that I won't revert to the monster I became." His thumbs had stroked my cheeks. "But then you smile at me, or you laugh at one of my terrible attempts at humor, or you fall asleep in that chair with a book on your chest, and I think, maybe I can be worthy of this, of you." "Celeste said I bring nothing to this court," I'd confessed, the words tumbling out. "And she's right, isn't she? I can't fight. I can't shift. I'm not politically connected or magically powerful or—" "Stop." King Dominic had pressed his forehead to mine, his breath warm against my skin. "Do you know what you bring, Elena? You bring peace to a man who'd forgotten what it felt like. You bring light to halls that have been dark for 7 years. You bring hope." He'd pulled back just enough to meet my eyes. "And your wolf? She's not dormant because she's broken. She's waiting because she's discerning. She won't surface for just anyone or anything. She's waiting for the moment when you truly need her, when your purpose becomes clear." "How can you be so sure?" "Because I read your mother's entire journal," he'd said. "Every lightbringer in your family's history. Their wolves emerged during moments of protection, of sacrifice, of standing between darkness and those they loved. Your wolf isn't absent, Elena. She's preparing." 3 weeks became 4, then 5. The castle staff grew accustomed to my presence, some warming to me, others remaining coldly neutral. I met the council, stern men and women who'd questioned their king's interest in a wolfless orphan, until he'd shut down their concerns with a look that could freeze fire. Sebastian's mate, Grace, became an unexpected friend. She was a warrior, scarred and strong, with a laugh that could fill a room and zero patience for social games. "Ignore the vultures," she'd told me over tea in her private quarters. "They're terrified because you're changing things." Dominic was predictable when he was frozen, angry, distant, but controllable through careful manipulation. You've made him unpredictable again, dangerous in a different way. "I don't understand," I'd said. "A king who cares about nothing is easy to maneuver," Grace had explained. "A king who's falling in love? That's chaos. That's someone who might actually burn down the world to protect what matters to him." Falling in love. The words had sent electricity through my veins. Was that what this was? These stolen evenings, these careful touches, these conversations that stretched past midnight, the way my heart raced when I saw him, the way my wolf reached toward him like a flower toward sunlight. One evening, 6 weeks after that first rain-soaked claiming moon, King Dominic took me to the castle's highest tower, the same one Sebastian had mentioned, where he'd gotten stuck as a younger man. We climbed the spiral stairs until we emerged onto a platform open to the night sky, stars scattered like diamonds across black velvet. "I used to come here when I needed to think," he'd said, standing beside me at the railing. The wind caught his dark hair, and below us, the kingdom spread out in a tapestry of lights and shadows. After Isabel died, I couldn't. Too many memories of happiness. "And now?" I'd asked softly. "Now I want to make new memories." He'd turned to face me, and something in his expression made my breath catch. "Elena, I need you to understand something. What's happening between us? It's not a whim or a distraction, or a way to prove I'm still capable of feeling. This is real." My heart hammered against my ribs. "I know, do you?" He'd stepped closer, and I could feel the heat radiating from him, could see the way his eyes had gone molten amber. "Because if we continue down this path, if you choose to stay, there will be challenges. The council will push back. Other packs will question. There are enemies who would use you to hurt me. You're trying to scare me away," I'd realized. "I'm trying to be honest," he'd corrected. "I'm trying to give you the choice that you deserve, with full knowledge of what you'd be accepting." I'd looked out at the kingdom, at the vast darkness punctuated by brave little lights. My mother's words had whispered through my mind. Even the smallest flame can light the darkest cave. "I'm terrified," I'd admitted, turning back to him. "Every day, I'm terrified that I'll wake up, and this will have been a dream, or that you'll realize you've made a mistake. But I'm more terrified of walking away and spending the rest of my life wondering what could have been." I'd reached up, my hand trembling only slightly as I'd touched his face, feeling the roughness of stubble against my palm. "So yes, Dominic, I choose to stay." The way he'd looked at me then, like I'd given him something infinitely precious, like I was the answer to every prayer he'd stopped believing in. That look had seared itself into my memory. "Can I kiss you?" he'd asked, his voice rough with restraint. "I've been wanting to for weeks, but I promised to go slow, and I meant it. But Elena, if you're choosing this, choosing us, I need—" "Yes," I'd whispered. He'd moved slowly, giving me time to change my mind, his hands coming up to frame my face with a gentleness that made my eyes sting. When his lips finally met mine, it was soft, questioning, achingly tender. Not the consuming passion of stories, but something sweeter, a promise, a beginning, a recognition. My first kiss, under a blanket of stars, with a king who'd forgotten how to be gentle until I'd reminded him. When we'd finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, my wolf had surged so close to the surface that my eyes flashed. Not with shift, not yet, but with power I'd never felt before. "She's close," King Dominic had murmured, seeing the glow. "Your wolf. She knows what I know." "What's that?" He'd smiled, pressing another kiss to my forehead. "That you're home." The kiss changed everything and nothing. We still took our evening walks, still spent hours in the library debating the merits of various novels, still sat in comfortable silence while he worked through council documents and I sketched in the margins of my notebook. But now there were stolen touches. His hand finding mine under the table during dinner, my fingers brushing through his hair when he fell asleep during our late-night conversations. Kisses that started soft and grew deeper, more urgent, before he'd pull back with a shaky breath and remind us both that we were taking this slowly. "You're killing me," he'd groaned one evening after a particularly heated kiss in the garden had left us both trembling. "Do you know how much restraint it takes to stop? Then don't stop," I'd whispered, emboldened by the hunger in his eyes. "Elena." He'd caught my hands, pressing them to his chest where I could feel his heart hammering. "When we take that step, I want you to be absolutely certain. No doubts, no fears, no rushing because you think it's expected." His thumb had traced my lower lip, and I'd shivered. I've waited 7 years to feel anything remotely close to this. I can wait a little longer to do it right. But fate, it seemed, had other plans about our timeline. It started with rumors, whispers that filtered through the castle staff, carried by servants who spoke in hushed tones when they thought no one was listening. Vampires had been spotted near the southern border, not the usual skirmishes, but organized movements, scouting parties that suggested something larger brewing. King Dominic's demeanor shifted. The softness that had been emerging hardened into strategic focus. Council meetings ran long into the night, and I'd find him in his study, maps spread across his desk, his jaw tight with tension. "Talk to me," I'd said one evening, finding him staring at reports with eyes that had gone distant and cold. "This doesn't concern you," he'd replied, not looking up. The dismissal had stung, but I'd recognized it for what it was. Protection, distance, a reversion to old habits when threatened. I'd walked around his desk and simply wrapped my arms around him from behind, resting my cheek against his back. He'd gone rigid, then slowly relaxed, his hands coming up to cover mine. "I'm scared," he'd admitted quietly. "Not of fighting. I know how to fight. I'm scared that something will happen to you because of me, because I was selfish enough to bring you into my life when I knew enemies would see you as a weakness to exploit." "I'm not a weakness," I'd said firmly. "And I'm not fragile, Dominic. Stop trying to shield me from everything. You don't understand what they're capable of." "Then help me understand." I'd moved to face him, my hands on his shoulders. "Let me in. All the way in. Stop treating me like I'll shatter at the first sign of darkness." He'd studied my face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "The vampires who killed Isabel, their coven was supposedly destroyed in the retribution strikes, but intelligence suggests they've been rebuilding, and their leader, an ancient vampire named Victor, has a particular hatred for me." He'd pulled up a sketch from his papers, a face that radiated cruelty, all sharp angles and dead eyes. "He believes I killed his mate during the final battle. He's not wrong. So this is about revenge," I'd said. "Revenge and territory. The southern lands are rich in resources they need. If they're massing forces, they're preparing for more than border raids." His hands had tightened on the desk edge. "I have to go. Lead the defensive preparations myself. Sebastian can hold the castle, but the front lines need—" "When?" I'd interrupted. 3 days. The Full Moon Council meets tomorrow to finalize strategy. Then we mobilize. 3 days. 72 hours before he'd ride into danger, before I'd be left behind wondering if he'd return. My wolf had snarled at the thought, rising so close to the surface that my vision had briefly shifted, showing me heat signatures and enhanced details. "She's protecting you," King Dominic had murmured, seeing the change in my eyes. "Your wolf. She knows what you mean to me." The Full Moon Council was a spectacle I'd only heard about. Every pack leader from the surrounding territories, all the high-ranking wolves, gathered in the Great Hall to discuss matters of war and policy. I wasn't supposed to attend. I had no rank, no official position. But Grace had appeared at my cottage that morning with a dress of deep forest green and a determined expression. "You're coming," she'd said, brooking no argument. "Sebastian agrees, even if he's too political to say it outright. Dominic needs you there, whether he knows it or not. The council will object. Let them." Grace had smiled fiercely. "You're the king's chosen. It's time everyone understood that." So I'd found myself in the Great Hall, dressed in borrowed finery, sitting in a chair that had been hastily added to the side of the raised platform where King Dominic presided. The looks I'd received had ranged from curious to hostile, but I'd kept my spine straight, remembering that I had as much right to be there as anyone. The meeting had been intense, arguments about troop deployments, debates over whether to take a defensive or offensive stance, concerns about leaving the castle undermanned. I'd listened, trying to follow the military strategy, until a pack leader named Garrett, a grizzled warrior with scars crisscrossing his face, had stood and addressed King Dominic directly. "Your Majesty, with all respect, the men are concerned. 7 years ago, you led us with single-minded focus. Now—" His gaze had flicked to me. "There are distractions. Rumors suggest your attention is divided." The room had gone silent. King Dominic's expression had turned to ice. "Are you questioning my capacity to lead, Garrett?" "I'm questioning your priorities," Garrett had said bluntly. "We're heading into war, and you're courting a wolfless girl with no combat training, no political connections, no— Enough." The word had cracked like a whip, and Dominic's power had filled the room, pressing down on everyone until several wolves had dropped their eyes in submission. "You will not speak of her that way." "Then tell us what she is," another council member had shouted. "Is she your mate, your consort, a passing fancy? The men deserve to know what they're fighting for." I'd felt every eye in the room turn to me, felt the weight of their judgment and doubt. My wolf had surged, and I'd felt her then, truly felt her for the first time, not as a whisper, but as a presence, powerful and ready. She'd wanted to emerge, to prove to these doubters that we were more than they assumed, but before I could speak, King Dominic had stood, his voice ringing through the hall. "Elena Thornfield is mine," he'd declared, the possessiveness in his tone unmistakable. "She is under my protection, my regard, and anyone who threatens her threatens me directly." He'd looked around the room, meeting each council member's eyes. "When I return from this campaign, I will formalize our bond. She will be my queen. And if anyone has objections, voice them now so I know who to exclude from the coronation." The silence had been deafening. My heart had stopped, then started again at triple speed. Queen. He'd just announced to his entire council that he intended to make me queen. Sebastian had been the first to stand, a grin splitting his face. Long overdue, if you ask me. Grace had followed, then others, until most of the room was standing in acceptance. But not all. Garrett had remained seated, his expression troubled. "Your Majesty, I mean no disrespect to Miss Thornfield, but a queen without a wolf." My wolf had chosen that moment to answer. Power had exploded through me, raw and overwhelming. My vision had shifted completely, the world blooming into vivid detail, every heartbeat in the room, every scent, every micro-expression. I hadn't fully shifted, but energy had rolled off me in waves. And when I'd spoken, my voice had carried an echo that made several wolves step back. "I have a wolf," I'd said. And it wasn't just me speaking, it was her, ancient and powerful, finally awakened. She's been waiting, preparing, growing strong in the darkness, and now she's ready. The transformation hadn't been complete, not yet, but light had emanated from my skin, silver and gold intertwined, and I'd felt her presence merge with mine completely, not dormant, not broken, waiting. King Dominic had been at my side instantly, his hand finding mine, grounding me as the power settled. "Breathe," he'd murmured. "Let her stabilize. You're doing beautifully." When my vision had cleared, I'd seen awe on faces that had held only dismissal moments before. Garrett had gone pale, then slowly stood and bowed. "Forgive me, Miss Thornfield," he'd said hoarsely. "I spoke in ignorance." The council had continued, but something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer the wolfless charity case. I was something else. Something they didn't fully understand but couldn't deny. After the meeting, King Dominic had pulled me into a private antechamber, his hands framing my face, his eyes searching mine with wonder and concern. "How do you feel?" he'd asked. "Like I've been sleeping my whole life and just woke up," I'd admitted. My wolf was still there, a golden warmth in my chest, patient and strong. "She's really here, Dominic. After all these years, she's finally here. Because you found your purpose," he'd said softly, standing beside me, facing down a room full of doubters, protecting what matters. He'd kissed me then, deep and claiming, and I'd kissed him back with equal fervor, my wolf rising to meet his in a way that felt ancient and right. When we'd broken apart, both breathing hard, he'd rested his forehead against mine. "I meant what I said in there. When I return, we formalize this. No more courtship, no more taking it slow. I want you as my mate, my queen, my everything." "When you return," I'd agreed. The words both a promise and a demand. Not if, when. The 3 days before his departure had passed in a blur of preparations. I'd watched him train with his warriors, had sat with Grace learning basic defensive maneuvers despite his protests, had spent every possible moment memorizing the lines of his face, the sound of his laugh, the way his eyes softened when he looked at me. The night before he left, he'd taken me back to the tower where we'd first kissed. "I have something for you," he'd said, pulling a small object from his pocket. It was a ring, not ornate, but beautiful in its simplicity, a silver band with a single moonstone that caught the starlight. It was my mother's. She gave it to my father before he went to war, and he came back to her. He'd slipped it onto my finger. "Come back to me, and I'll replace this with a proper queen's ring. But for now, wear this. Remember that I'm fighting to return to you." I'd thrown my arms around him, holding tight enough to bruise. "You'd better come back, Dominic Ashenfell. Because my wolf and I, we're not done with you yet." He'd laughed against my hair, the sound thick with emotion. "I'll come back. I promise." The next morning, I'd stood with the other families as the warriors assembled, had watched King Dominic mount his horse with Sebastian and the others, had felt my heart crack as he'd looked back one last time, his eyes finding mine across the crowd. Then they'd ridden south, toward danger and darkness, and I'd been left behind with a wolf finally awakened and a terrible, growing certainty that something was wrong. The feeling had started small, a prickling at the base of my skull, a restlessness in my wolf. But over the next week, it had grown into certainty. Something was coming. Not from the south where Dominic fought, but from somewhere closer, darker. And I was going to need every ounce of my newfound power to face it. The attack came on the 8th night. I'd been in the library, unable to sleep, poring over my mother's journal that Dominic had left for me. Grace had stayed at the castle, helping coordinate supply lines and communications, and she'd joined me with tea and her usual blunt comfort. "Stop torturing yourself," she'd said, watching me read the same passage for the 3rd time. "Dominic knows what he's doing. Sebastian sent word this morning. They've secured the first defensive line without major casualties. It's not the south I'm worried about," I'd admitted, that prickling sensation growing stronger. My wolf paced restlessly beneath my skin. "Something feels wrong here, close." Grace had opened her mouth to respond when the first explosion shook the castle. We'd both jumped to our feet as screams erupted from the courtyards below. Grace had shifted instantly, her wolf form massive and battle-scarred, while I'd run to the window and felt my blood turn to ice. Vampires. Dozens of them, pouring through a breach in the southern wall, not the distant southern border where Dominic fought, but the castle's own southern perimeter. It had been a diversion. The entire campaign had been designed to draw the king and his strongest warriors away, leaving the castle vulnerable. "It's a trap," I'd breathed. "Dominic, we have to warn him." But there was no time. Vampires were in the castle, and the remaining guards were overwhelmed. I could hear fighting in the corridors, could smell blood and smoke. Grace had shifted back just long enough to grab my shoulders. "Listen to me. There's a hidden passage behind the fireplace in Dominic's study. It leads to the forest. You run, Elena. You get to safety and you—" "No." My wolf surged, and this time I didn't fight her. Power flooded my veins, that silver gold light emanating from my skin. "I'm not running. Not anymore. You can't fight them alone. I'm not alone." I'd felt her then. My wolf, fully present and ready. We'd never completed a transformation, never achieved the full shift, but we didn't need to. My mother's journal had spoken of Lightbringers fighting differently, not with claws and teeth, but with something older, something that vampires, creatures of darkness and death, would fear. The library doors had burst open. 3 vampires, their eyes red with bloodlust, their faces twisted into inhuman snarls. The lead one had smiled when he'd seen me. "The king's pet," he'd hissed. "Victor will reward us well for your head." I'd stepped forward, and light had exploded from my hands. It hadn't been fire or lightning. Nothing so simple. It had been pure life force, the opposite of everything vampires represented. And where it touched them, they'd screamed. The lead vampire had disintegrated into ash, and the other 2 had fled, shrieking. Grace had stared at me, her eyes wide. "What in the actual—" "My mother's bloodline," I'd said, understanding clicking into place. Lightbringers weren't just empaths or healers. We were vampire hunters. Our light burns them. We'd fought our way through the castle, Grace in her wolf form and me channeling power I was learning to control with each passing moment. Other defenders had rallied around us, guards, servants, anyone who could hold a weapon. I'd found myself directing them, my wolf lending me an authority I'd never possessed before. "Barricade the east wing. Get the children to the cellars. Someone get a message to the king. Tell him it's a diversion. Tell him to come back." We'd been holding our own until Victor himself had appeared. He'd been ancient, powerful in ways the others weren't. And when he'd looked at me, recognition and hatred had blazed in his dead eyes. "You," he'd snarled. "You carry Evelyn's light. I killed her myself 20 years ago, but she burned half my coven before she fell." He'd smiled, showing fangs. "I've been searching for her bloodline ever since. Such power shouldn't exist to oppose us. My mother." He'd killed my mother. Not some random tragedy, but a targeted assassination. Rage had joined with my power, making it burn brighter. "You took her from me," I'd said, my voice echoing with wolf and light combined. "You took everything from me, and now I'll finish what I started." Victor had moved with supernatural speed, but my wolf had been faster. We'd met in a clash of light and shadow, and the battle had been brutal. He'd been stronger, more experienced, but my power had been anathema to his very existence. The fight had destroyed half the library. Shelves had toppled, ancient books scattered like fallen leaves. Grace and the others had held off his remaining forces while Victor and I had circled each other, both wounded, both refusing to yield. "You cannot win," he'd hissed, his flesh smoking where my light had touched. "Even if you destroy me, there will be others. Your light makes you a target, little girl. You'll spend your life running, hiding, watching everyone you love die because of what you are." "No," I'd said, and certainty had filled me. "I'll spend my life fighting, protecting, being exactly what my mother trained me to be, even if she never got the chance to tell me." I'd gathered every ounce of power I possessed, feeling my wolf merge with me completely. "And I'll start by ending you." The final burst of light had been blinding. Victor had screamed, a sound of such agony that windows had shattered, and then he'd been nothing but ash drifting in the smoke-filled air. I'd collapsed immediately after, my power spent, my body shaking. Grace had caught me before I hit the ground, her human hands gentle despite her warrior's strength. "You magnificent, insane woman," she'd murmured. "You just killed an ancient vampire. Dominic is going to lose his mind." The battle had ended shortly after. Without Victor's control, the remaining vampires had fled or been destroyed. The castle had been damaged but standing, and casualties, while tragic, had been far lighter than they should have been. I'd spent the next 2 days in a haze of exhaustion and healing, my wolf retreating to recover while my human body dealt with the aftermath of channeling so much power. Grace had stayed beside me, along with the castle healers, all of them amazed that I'd survived. But I'd kept asking for Dominic, needing to know he'd received the message, that he was safe, that he was coming back. He'd arrived on the 3rd day. I'd been in the gardens, finally strong enough to walk, when I'd heard the commotion at the gates. My wolf had surged weakly, and I'd known before I saw him. Dominic had dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, his eyes wild as they scanned the damaged castle, the repair crews, the burn marks on the stone walls. Sebastian had been saying something, but he'd ignored his beta completely, his gaze searching until it found me. The relief on his face had been devastating. He'd crossed the garden in seconds, and then I'd been in his arms, lifted off my feet as he'd held me so tightly I could barely breathe. He'd been shaking, his face buried in my hair, and I'd realized he was crying. "I thought I lost you," he'd choked out. "When we got the message, when I realized what had happened, Elena, I thought, I'm here." I'd whispered, my own tears falling. "I'm alive. We held them off. You killed Victor." He'd pulled back just enough to look at me, his hands framing my face. "Grace told me everything. You transformed. You led the defense. You destroyed a vampire that's been terrorizing Pax for centuries." His thumb had traced my cheek. "You saved my castle, my people. You—" I'd kissed him before he could finish, pouring everything I felt into it. Relief, love, the bone-deep certainty that this was where I belonged. He'd kissed me back with equal desperation, and my wolf had reached for his, the connection between us singing. When we'd finally broken apart, both breathing hard, his forehead had rested against mine. "Marry me," he'd said. "Not because of crowns or councils or politics. Marry me because I love you, because you're the bravest person I've ever known, because the thought of spending another day without you as my mate makes it hard to breathe." "Yes," I'd said, laughing and crying at the same time. Yes, 1,000 times yes. The wedding had taken place 1 month later, as autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Every pack in the kingdom had attended, along with delegations from allied territories. I'd worn a dress of silver that caught the light, my blonde hair woven with moonflowers, and when I'd walked down the aisle, I'd seen not a single look of doubt or dismissal. They'd seen their queen, the Lightbringer who'd defended their home, the woman who'd awakened a power long thought lost to history. Dominic had waited at the altar in formal black, his eyes never leaving mine, and when we'd spoken our vows, our wolves had merged in a bond so powerful that everyone present had felt it, a joining of darkness and light, strength and compassion, two broken souls made whole. Sebastian had officiated, his voice thick with emotion. Grace had stood as my attendant, fierce and proud. Even my aunt had attended, though she'd stayed silent in the back, her expression unreadable. The celebration had lasted 3 days, but the moment I'd cherished most had been our first night as mates, when Dominic had carried me to the tower where we'd first kissed, and we'd stood under the stars, his arms around me, our future spread out before us like those distant lights. "Are you happy?" He'd murmured against my hair. "More than I ever thought possible," I'd admitted. "I spent so long thinking I was broken, that I'd never be enough for anyone. And now you're a queen who killed an ancient vampire, commands light itself, and has an entire kingdom willing to follow you into darkness." He'd turned me in his arms, his eyes soft. "But more importantly, you're the woman who saved me, who reminded me that being gentle isn't weakness, that opening your heart after loss isn't foolish. It's the bravest thing anyone can do." "We saved each other," I'd corrected, reaching up to touch his face. "You gave me a place to belong, a purpose, a home." He'd kissed me then, slow and deep, and we'd made love under the stars with a tenderness that still held passion, with a connection that went beyond physical into something transcendent. My wolf had sung with joy, and his had answered, and I'd understood what my mother's lullaby had truly meant. Even the smallest flame can light the darkest cave, not because it burns brightest, but because it refuses to be extinguished. Because it finds another flame, and together, they become an inferno. Years passed. We ruled together, Dominic's strategic mind balanced by my diplomatic heart. We faced challenges, political intrigue, border disputes, the occasional vampire incursion that I handled with increasing skill as I learned to control my Lightbringer abilities. Sebastian and Grace's children played in our courtyards. The castle that had been cold and lonely became filled with laughter and life. I turned the Northern Territories, my family's old lands, into a sanctuary for other wolfless individuals, proving that lacking a shift didn't mean lacking worth. And when our own daughter was born 5 years later, with her father's dark hair and my light eyes, when her first shift came at age 3 and she glowed with that same silver gold light before becoming a wolf as white as snow, Dominic had held us both and wept with gratitude. "She has your mother's gift," he'd whispered, watching our daughter play. "The next Lightbringer. She has all of us," I'd corrected. "Your strength, my light, and a kingdom that will teach her she's never been anything but extraordinary." Sometimes, in quiet moments, I thought about the girl I'd been, invisible, frightened, convinced she'd never be enough. I thought about standing in the rain while a king asked my name, about learning that my supposed weakness was actually power waiting for the right moment, about choosing courage over fear again and again until it became second nature. My mother had been right. I had illuminated paths, not just for myself but for others who felt broken or lost, and in doing so, I'd found my own way home. The castle bells rang in the distance, calling us to dinner. Dominic took my hand, our daughter running ahead of us, her laughter echoing through halls that had once known only silence. My wolf hummed contentedly, at peace in a way I'd never imagined possible. I was Elena Ashenfell, Queen of the Lycans, Lightbringer, mate to a king who'd been lost in darkness until I'd helped him find the light. But more than any title, I was home. I was loved. I was exactly where I was meant to be. And that, I'd learned, was the greatest